Have you ever met somebody who's lost the plot? Have you ever met somebody who's estranged from reality? Have you ever met somebody for whom the truth is just not going to be good enough? They've got their world built up around them and nothing's going to change their mind. In fact, the more that you try to show them the truth, the more that they just get angry and get less and less logical. We see something kind of like that in our readings today. Today's Thursday of the 5th week of Lent, and we have a reading from the book of Genesis in which God establishes his covenant with Abraham. And then we have a reading from the Gospel of John where the Jews are challenging Jesus because he's talking about everlasting life. And they say, not even Abraham had everlasting life, so who do you think you are, right? Who do you think you are? For the Jewish people at the time of Jesus, they were living with a certain sense of embarrassment. And that embarrassment was that the promised land that God had given them, that said would be theirs as part of God's promise to them, so long as they were God's people, this land would be theirs. And yet it was occupied by the Romans. And so in some sense, they had a sense of superiority, that this was their land, that God had given it to them. But they also had a sense that somehow God was not totally pleased with them because the Romans occupied that land. And so you can imagine they were just a little bit touchy when it came to this topic. And so Jesus says, you don't even know your father Abraham. If you'd known him, you'd know that he'd be happy that I am here. Okay, this is about as bad a thing as you could tell those guys. Their nationality, their race, their religion was all tied up in this understanding of being a spiritual child of Abraham, of worshiping the one true God, tied up in this covenant established with Abraham. And so when Christ arrives on the scene, he challenges that sense of who they are, and they are angry. I think it's interesting to go back to that reading from Genesis and look at the first and last lines of this particular reading. The first lines are, when Abraham prostrated himself, God spoke to him. My covenant with you is this, etc., etc. When Abraham prostrated himself, laid himself down low in the presence of God, humbled himself, in other words, that is when God spoke to him. It's got to be the same way for us. Because if you think there are some people who have lost the plot, if you think there are some people who don't have a good relationship to the truth, all you got to do is turn on the TV to see it, right? But what about looking inside at yourself? In what ways have you said, I do have the right truth. I belong to the right political party. I go to the right church where we do things the right way. I do, where we have this sense of ourselves that simply cannot be challenged. This is the incorrect way to approach God. When Abraham prostrates himself, God speaks to him. God makes all these promises, and then God tells Abraham, on your part, you and your descendants after you must keep my covenant throughout the ages. You must keep my covenant throughout the ages. God must be God. God does not hand us a system, and we take that system and we implement it, and then we can say, look, we've done all that we have to do. We are good. We're fine on our own as long as we instituted this system. That is not what God calls us to do. God calls us to make God our God constantly renewing the fact that he is Lord and Lord above all, and that we are here to serve him as his alone. That's what we are called to. You can see some crazy people on the internet, right? You can see some crazy people in the news, but look inside just a little bit and make sure that you have not disconnected yourself from the truth just so that you can live in some alternate world where you've built up all the right walls around yourself to define yourself as unable to be changed by God. During this Lenten season, we are certainly called to grow closer to Christ, to see him better, to draw near to him, to love him more. But during Lent, we are still called to look deep down inside and find ways in which sin may have taken hold and may be pointing us in the wrong direction, and even in the wrong direction to the point that we think that we are doing everything right. We must give Jesus the space to move inside of us and renew our spirits and renew our souls to help make us better people. Amen.